So the operation then can be set up or runtime. Okay. And then we have an additional cost ID. This is one of those I don't go in very often, so I can't remember whether we've transitioned it yet. There it is. Good. So I'm just bringing up that same cost ID to talk a little bit about the cost ID. By and large, actually more than by and large, our cost is a standard rate, I guess standard cost, so to speak. It's a fixed cost. In other words, we're not matching it against an actual invoice or anything like that. We're basically saying the cost per unit that you want to apply here is what's going to go to the cost roll-up as well as the batch. So actual and theoretical is controlled here. There's only one place to deal with that cost. And that rate, arguably, we probably should drop the term hourly because that kind of narrows your focus on how you could apply it. Because it's not really just hourly. I mean, I think when we created the screen, we were thinking in terms of labor, but it's really a unit rate, a per unit rate. So the cost is what we're really talking about here. So I'm saying I want to charge $8.50 per unit that I applied under either setup or runtime that we dealt with. So that's where we're picking up that cost, and this is the only place we pick up that cost. So this is a really heavy trigger for you, or a lever to know about. When you start setting up standards, when you start setting up labor and overhead application rates, what some people will do is they will say, no matter what it is, no matter how complicated it is, I'm going to apply a certain number of dollars per unit that I'm creating. $5 a unit. I've seen it, works for some companies, got no issues with it. If you do that, what I would recommend is keep your hourly rate here at, I think I said $5. So set it up as $5 here with your quantity on the item being 1. Because that way, if you have a price change, if you want to dial it in, you come to one place and change it from the $5 to $5.20 to $4.90 to whatever to help dial in that application rate. The alternative would be setting this as 1 and putting 5 down at the item and 4 down at another item and 3 down at another item. So you've got 2 levers you can always work with, the cost per unit and the number of units. So just kind of remember that as you move forward. And think through, when you propose which route you take, whether you put the dollars up here on hourly rate or you put the dollars down in the unit, just think about what happens 6 months from now when you want to change that rate. Just have a mental exercise so that you've already prepared for how much work it would be to make that change. You can work with both, of course. So we've seen people, hours is the easiest thing to say. You can say, here's the amount of time or effort that is associated with making that product. You put that in the unit, and the cost of that people or person is on the hourly rate. That's the standard kind of way you would probably walk into this. There are other people that look at it and say, I want it based on kind of a percentage of effort. So for example, a standard item in my workflow is $10 a unit that I want to apply. Some of them are harder to make, and some of them are easier to make. So you could actually use $10 a unit here, and then that quantity is actually a factor. 0.75 for the easier stuff to make, 1.25 for the harder stuff to make, the average would be 1. So just know that you've got a quantity and a price lever that you can work with to kind of dial this in.
So the trick is, if you set your standard hourly rate to be something that is no longer working,
right?
And so instead of having one at $10, we really want it to be $11. If I change the hourly rate to 11, it's going to roll down to all items that contain packaging.
That's right.
If I leave it at 10 and change the fixed overhead amount to 1.1, then I have to go into every single item and update that individually.
What I was really referring to, and maybe I was a little confusing, so we were using 10 and 11 here as an example. I was referring to you would have to come back to the component entry screen and change this application rate from
right. On each item.
On each item. That's
so
right.
The easier way would be to change the rate.
Yeah, if a rate change would go to every item the same way.
Right.
Yep. And if they don't go the same way, then you might want to think in terms of maybe use a factor for the quantity. So here, where it's 0.1667, you might find that a standard item kind of one that you don't have any issues with holds a quantity of 1. Something that's more difficult, more finicky, that you want to allocate more cost to might be a 1.2. So it gets 20% more of that factor. So just kind of know, the point I want you to take away from here is you've got 2 levers. One is a cost per unit and another is a unit. All right. We okay on that? And kind of where that's set up? Before I leave off of that, let me go back to this packaging that the unit set up and just talk about the other items associated with it, because I think it's important to know. Currently, the effective date isn't being used. It's a memo field. Don't think too much about it. The next fields, fixed overhead and variable overhead, are really used to help add to that 850. So, for example, I could say, I want my hourly rate to be $8.50. That's a base rate that I've got. And then I want to add in addition to that $1, and then in addition to that $1.50. So in this case, I've got $10.50. I think my math is right. No, whatever that is, $9, $10, $11 total that's being applied based on packaging. So it's just an additive. We add 3 fields together. The reason we're doing this comes down to the accounts. These are the GL accounts that are being hit and being allocated. So you could take a certain number of dollars, in this case $8.50 per unit, is getting allocated to one GL account. Another $1 per unit is being allocated to this field called fixed overhead, and then another is variable overhead.
So direct labor is the hourly rate. Okay, direct labor
Yep.
account is the hourly
That's fair.
account.
Yep.
Gotcha.
Yep. And then the fixed overhead account is the fixed overhead number, etc. And if that weren't complicated enough, we added it as a percentage as well. So, same here. Is there a question coming? All right, good. Seth, in all Dynamics applications, we're writing the GL transaction at this point?
Not SL.
Not SL. Okay, so with exception of SL, we write these transactions directly to the general ledger. In SL, you can do a month-end report in Vicinity View or report and book the journal entry. But we're tracking the GL accounts. So in NAV and GP, we will actually write the transaction directly to the general ledger, to those accounts. Okay. So that's our additional cost setup. Again, we use the term additional cost intentionally because it's not just labor. It's not just labor overhead. And you can have as many of those as you like. And we just now assigned that additional cost at the component level. So for every component coming out gets that cost. So far we've talked about packaging costs and we've talked about additional costs, specifically additional costs tied to the component or the output item. I'm going to pivot to the formula. So if we kind of keeping score at home back on our report that we were just looking at, what we've just talked about is the application of these bill of material components and the application of this bill of material runtime. This one was set up as runtime. So you might see runtime or setup, and you might see multiples listed there. So let's talk a little bit about the formula. So the other way in which we can assign costs would be based on the formula. Most folks that start, by the way, start by the component, and then they work their way into the formula. So on the formula side, the ingredient, I think, is pretty straightforward. At least the quantity is pretty straightforward. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but so in a formula, we've got unit procedures, machines. And we allow you to assign additional costs at the machine level. And what I mean by that is my cursor right now is on the mash tun, which is a piece of equipment in the brew house. And in doing so, I can have additional costs associated with that piece of equipment, with that machine. There's a button up here in the action bar activity bar that allows me to see the costs that I've associated with this piece of equipment. So you'll see that what we're talking about is allocating costs at the mash tun level, at the unit procedure level. So at that machine, I've got these costs available to me. I am going to intentionally move my cursor from the mash tun to the lauder tun, come back to that, and I see those costs are not there. There aren't costs there. So the costs are actually associated at the machine level. Now, you don't have to be really specific in every piece of equipment. You have a different labor and overhead. We're giving you the ability that if you want to, at each piece of equipment, you could allocate a different cost associated with the piece of equipment. I'm not sure how much more granular we could get than that. So just know that that's there. And again, additional costs for us could be the machine cost, overhead. It could also be the labor of running the machine. It could really be any cost that you want to associate with it. I think the part that you should know about this, unlike a finished product, where a finished product, or when you assign it to a component, the application of that cost on a component is based on the output of the inventory. These costs that we're talking about are really geared toward the input of product, size of the batch, the amount of raw material going into the process is really kind of the basis that this is based on. So I can have as many additional costs as I want. I've just got a cost called brew. And basically we're saying that no matter how big the brew is, no matter how big the batch is, I'm going to assign 2 units. We can call it hours if we want. We're assigning 2 units no matter how big the batch is. Okay. Know that when I get to batch entry, I could overwrite it. So it's going to say it takes 2 hours to do this batch. That's your standard. I could say it took me 2.5 or 1.9. I can override from the standard. But this is not going to vary by the size of the batch. So if I make half a batch, it's still going to assume that it took you 2 hours. Conceptually, I think that's probably true for many of us, is it takes us about the same amount of time to make a full batch as it does a half a batch, when we're talking about the mixing part of it, not the filling part of it. So that's kind of why you see this here. Hours is just a total, it's a fixed, no matter how big the batch is. The next 2 are based on raw materials, or based on inventory, size of the batch. And in this case, hours, my demo company is working in barrels, a volumetric unit of measure. So based on the number of barrels put in, size of the batch is what I'm talking about here. So I can set a rate based on the size of the batch. So if you are in a scenario where the size of the batch is relevant, half a batch takes half the amount of time, then great, you would use the amount based on size, barrels in or pounds in or gallons in, whatever. There's a misnomer, at least from my side of things. It took me a long time to get this through my head. Barrels out isn't probably what you think it is. It's not finished product. It's not intermediate coming out of the process. That's not what it is. It's byproduct or co-product. So it's only ingredients on the formula, not the end item section, but only the quantity of byproduct coming out or co-product coming out. We have clients that want to apply costs to the batch based on the processing of the byproduct, disposal type fee, that kind of thing. That's the purpose behind it. So it's not probably where your gut would tell you it is. Your gut would probably tell you the out means that's the intermediate coming out or the finished good coming out. That's not the case. So the top 2 are normally the ones people use. If you're in a scenario where I want to allocate a certain cost no matter the size of the batch, use hours. If it's variable based on the size, you have a variable size, variable fill of a batch, and you want the labor overhead to apply accordingly, use the hours per unit in. We get into the same scenario we saw under the component, where if we've got a fixed cost, it's going to take a certain number of hours, i.e. a certain number of dollars. Let's say it's $10 an hour. So now I've got $20 to process this batch. When I try to take that down to a per unit item on a cost roll-up, I need to know the denominator. I need to know how I allocate that. So what is the typical size of the batch? And that's where this capacity comes into play, right here. So cost roll-up is going to come and look at that and say, here is the capacity I'm going to divide by. I got $100 divided by 50. I've got $2 a unit when I get down to the individual item, a barrel or a pound or a gallon of formula. Okay. So that's the assignment of those costs. Good so far? Which means,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Question. On the capacity, the size of the batch.
yep.
Is that, because we're still running on the old version, we haven't updated yet, is that on the batch size min and max or the default?
Yeah, it's none of those.
It's none of those.
Right.
Okay.
Explain where your question's coming from.
Well, because you said that the hours, that the additional costs can be calculated off the size of the batch, right?
Yes.
So if we're not utilizing that, how is it doing it now?
Do you, in your system, are you using setup or runtime, or actually that was a finished product term? On the formula, when you allocate based on the formula, do you know if you are, get my head together here. Do you know if you're using hours or hours per unit?
Hours, pounds, and
Okay, so what it's doing in that scenario, this capacity isn't relevant to the conversation. The only time this capacity field that has 50 in it right now, the only time that's relevant is when it's hours. And it's and it's only relevant in a cost roll up or when I got to go from a fixed cost to a cost per unit, which is the best of my thinking off the top of my head. I think the cost roll up is the only real place that that comes into play. And Seth is always
I've got a note to myself to look at the usage of capacity for cost roll-up. To answer your question, I think it's using the default batch size, the default formula size for allocating for the remote process. You're wondering where it's getting the batch size to start off with. And I think it's going back to the formula scheme and using the default.
so if we don't have anything in that default, then.
Yeah, this is kind of in the back deep access of my mind.
Okay.
But I'm not 100% certain of the capacity usage on that roll-up.
Okay, we'll check in.
Yeah, I've got a note to clarify that for both Randy and everybody here.
If, to be clear here, if you're using hours per pound in, it's not relevant. Because it's already at a per unit cost. It's only relevant if you're using hours. Because on the cost roll-up, we've got to be able to get down to a cost per pound. And you've got to have some way to allocate it. What did that 2 mean? How big was the standard batch size? Right.
So if we're saying hours, pounds in, where is it getting the batch, where is it getting the quantity then?
Gotcha. Great question. So when I'm going to come back to the cost roll up and answer that question. So that was there. There we go. Okay. So what you're asking, I think, is this cost per unit, this unit cost is coming from dynamics. That's probably pretty straightforward. It's whatever the number is per pound. It's this quantity that I think you're asking about. So we understand a relationship between a formula and a finished product. Okay, so in the subcomponent section, when I set up a finished good, in the subcomponent section, I say, here's a formula, and to make this stocking unit of measure, with in your case might be pounds, whatever it is, there's a relationship between this formula and that pounds of finished product. If it's 1, it makes it really easy. If it's a container of something, a drum that's measured in eaches, we understand the amount of formula that goes into a standard drum. That's just part of setting up the item. So now I understand that to make an each, I do understand how much formula goes into that. So in effect, what this report is doing is resizing the formula to make 1 unit. And that's where the quantity is actually coming from. Good question.